which was held on around about the same day as last year. So the first news release that was issued was the 21st of December 2020, obviously after the AGM. At that particular time, there was obviously a significant advance was the inclusion of the 52 Brazilian banks into Revolugroup, and also the news that PNC, US megabank, was proposing to acquire BBVA. As shareholders are aware, BBVA was and still is our partner in Europe, but was our partner in the United States at that time. Subsequently, we had a news release on the 30th of December 2020, which informed shareholders that we had launched the Revolugroup cryptocurrency exchange platform. And also, we mentioned for the first time the DCE affiliates, and at that particular moment in time, the potential alliance with Huobi. Moving on to January 18th, 2021, we officially launched the platform that had been pending for approximately 8 months, which was Revolugroup POS, the point of sale app for Apple and Android devices. The Revolugroup POS, obviously, we needed that synergy in order to allow the Revolugroup platform to function correctly for those people who were not using our mobile app. Moving on to February the 8th, 2021, we proposed the future launch of the Canadian dollar, the US dollar, and the GBP, all of them fundamental for the continuation of our rollout of different verticals that we were working on at the time and we're currently working on right now. We also explained in great detail to shareholders in that news release, and this is something that I wanted to underline during the AGM, that the company's strategy was to procure users through white label scenarios. White label scenarios being, in our view, probably the most effective way of us penetrating the market and accruing a huge amount of users, and obviously the adoption of our financial technology. So that was essentially the first instance in which we laid that out clearly. And as we will see as the year went along, we started seeing the advent of some of those white labels. I entered into a non-disclosure agreement at that time, actually on the 1st of February, and that is with a Caribbean mobile phone operator who is still looking at with us the usage of our different verticals in a white label scenario to, actually they have 40 million users now, it was 13 at the time. But again, I'm still referring to February the 8th of this year. Further mentions in that particular news, and I guess this was the most revealing news up to that point, was the insertion, obviously, of the NASDAQ listed company, and also the synergy with the FSA out of Dubai, and some basic indication as to how that will impact the company as we move forward with the white label program. Just move this down here. So we have, obviously, that is basically the essence of the white label in that particular month. Moving on to the 16th of February, we have the introduction of a future partner, which had been mentioned way back in 2017, 2018, which was obviously Alipay, which then materialized not just for Alipay, but also UnionPay. But I'll get onto that as we approach the date in when that was actually finally released. And then we had more Revolugroup countries, an additional 10 countries. You can see them on the news: Bangladesh, Cambodia, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, and many others. All of these obviously have been fundamental as we've moved ahead, attracting those white labels we have and those that are still pending. Moving on to February the 22nd, we had the final launch of the first introduction of the currencies within the Revolupay Act. So we included at that moment in time the Canadian dollar and the US dollar. Of course, the inclusion of the US dollar is evidently a precursor to the later granting of the MSB license. But again, we were way ahead of ourselves there in terms of getting that US dollar introduced in February of this year. Moving on to March the 15th, we had the final launch of Alipay, which, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, did include UnionPay, which was fundamental because it also meant the inclusion of loading of the UnionPay cards. Those advents took place during that period of time, so March the 15th. The UnionPay inclusion, I think, a lot more significant than shareholders possibly understood at the time. But because we haven't actually utilized that relationship yet in what will be a future white label, then it has been largely irrelevant at least until today. But the significance of the inclusion of that, obviously we have to lay out the ability for the tech to do something before we can create the synergy with the eventual white label partner, and in this particular case in the jurisdiction of China. Moving on to April 19th this year, we had what was, I would consider, obviously the soft launch of Million Bridges. We're all acutely aware that they took their time to launch officially. We had later, and I will mention it, obviously the inclusion of the Red Cross, and I think that the inertia that they created after the 31st of August is self-evident. So I won't try to underline that. I think shareholders are acutely aware that while that was a soft launch on April the 19th, that they did start to gather some steam probably mid to the end of August and then into September. We cited BTA Wealth Management, obviously directly associated with DFSA in Dubai, and then obviously the link back with that to the heavily protracted Revolugroup. All of those three elements are intrinsically associated with each other. Revolugroup requiring this license in order to be able to function as planned. We also revealed the upcoming advent of the BISM EU wallet load, and something that became extremely important towards the end of this year was the BBVA merchant accounts and the inclusion of those in our agreement. Again, largely overlooked by shareholders, but fundamentally important to certain aspects of the business that we are seeing approach right now at this moment in time. So throughout that particular April 19th news release, we have aspects that are still ongoing, and it gives shareholders an idea of the importance of these things, why they are so protracted, why it's taking longer than we would like, but based upon the fact that these are quite important aspects, and they're all interconnected with other aspects, but I'll run through them anyway. ACH transfers, USA, Canada, UAE. Top tier card issuer negotiations, top 4 card issuer in the world. The hash wallet and the relationship between the hash wallet, our Visa card, and the ability of our Visa card to be associated directly into the hardware of the hash wallet. Again, upcoming advents that I guess shareholders can get an idea of how that synergy would interact with entities such as the DCs like Huobi, Dizdak, and others. Okay, Revolue transfer launch. That again linked intrinsically to advents and news that I'll follow with later, but that again still something that's pending. And then we had another mention of the GBP, which was the 4th currency and one that was still not integrated at that time. So moving on, 22nd of April, significant to the company, significant to us as management, probably less so for shareholders. We did change our auditors. We did move to Chroma Key. There are several reasons why we did that, some of which on an operational basis in terms of the fact that we had transitioned almost entirely. It's important to recognize that Davidson and Company were the auditors of the company way before I took over, way back in the days when this was a mining issuer. So the fact that we progressed into the fintech world, the fact that we obtained the licenses we'd obtained, we needed a company with a clear understanding. And this is also linked to the aspirations of the uplist onto the big board, the TSX, and there is an intrinsic association between change of auditors and those few facets that I've mentioned, and a couple of others, not particularly relevant to shareholders, but just on an operational basis for us, we needed an auditor that could provide us with certain types of support and understood the mechanisms, central bank related activities and things like that. Basically more adept at the fintech realm, which is, as shareholders have seen, especially the ones that have been with us for several years, there has been an enormous transition towards that sector. So moving on, May 20th, 2021, we divested, for obvious reasons, the Pigeon Molly property. That was just something that was relegated on our books that we did not particularly need for any reason whatsoever, and so we offloaded that. That was the extent of that particular news. Moving on to June the 1st, the issues that were pending at that time, MSB license USA, again, we obviously achieved that since then, and then things that have been protracted, and I'm not going to say anything other than these aspects are fundamentally important, and we need to conclude them. DIFC and also the Dubai PSP license, top tier card issuer, continues to be protracted. The Huobi white label, again, pushed forward until January, the most recent information we received from the company. And then the BISM e-wallet, while it was still pending at that time, as everybody is aware, that was finally included. But we did mention during that news release the concept that the white label angle that we were pursuing at that particular time, that we mentioned a month or so prior to, that we had the first entities coming on board, and shareholders now know that when we were referring to that, that actually resulted in being Sendity. Moving on, June 14th, 2021. We lost about 7 months there with the back and forth with BBVA, waiting for regulators to eventually approve that acquisition. We couldn't push forward with BBVA during that period of time. There were plenty of aspects that we were trying to push forward with. They weren't receptive to that because of the fact that they were in negotiations with PNC and it still hadn't been agreed. And likewise, we obviously couldn't reach out to PNC to formulate some of the advances that we've later achieved. So that we had about 7 months downtime there, to be frank. And that relationship obviously is fundamental to the US market penetration. In a subsidiary manner, we obviously added more countries. There's 10 extra countries at that time, some of them relatively important, especially Singapore, to what came a little later. Moving on again, literally the following day, we revealed that it was actually Prosegur Cash, the entity that had decided that we had the best remittance technology and that they wanted to use our technology. Any of the shareholders who think that they didn't have the option to work with other companies are mistaken. That they obviously did. But our technology, as you've seen, first of all, is extremely efficient. It has minimal human interaction, and it's also extremely economical. In fact, they've gone as far through Gelt Cash to actually blatantly put out their comparisons with some of the largest remittance companies in the world, just to show how economical our platform is. But anyway, I think that was a seal of approval for the fact of us pursuing that. It had been many years to ferment that particular aspect of the business, starting way back when with Thunes and BBVA and creating all that platform. But I think that was a nice seal of approval. $2.09 billion market cap, Madrid Stock Exchange quoted. Very happy. Management very happy with that vote of recognition from a company of that size. And many more to come. But I'll get on to the future advents in a moment. June 16th, the reason why we put out news the next day was that obviously pretty significant that the fledgling Million Bridges, how they could even get an agreement with the Red Cross and different NGOs was obviously surprising, and we thought shareholders should know that. And we also mentioned, and this is something that you're going to see more of in 2022, the division inside this company of Revolugroup Humanitarian. Through the relationships with Million Bridges, the fermenting of NGOs and other entities that have jumped on board, we're seeing a lot of gouging. We're seeing things that I've mentioned to shareholders way back in 2017, 2018, of just how atrociously bad some of these mechanisms are, and just, the poor just being violated constantly. And while I don't want to get on a mission on this call about how atrocious that is, we are pursuing, we'll continue to pursue, and possibly relationships directly with some of these NGOs in other areas. So you want to keep your eye out for those things. We did include at that time, do bear in mind, we had mentioned a couple of months previously about the inclusion of Canadian dollar, US dollar. They were actually added to the app at that time. Significant advent, obviously on a technical basis, having to count the spot accounts and things like that in the background, a little more consuming in terms of time than meets the eye. Moving on to June the 25th, the agreement, the DA with Exxon from Singapore, again, intrinsically linked to news a couple of months before where we had to include Singapore in that. We also had the advent, quite a surprising advent in my view, based upon on other facts, including open banking, that's been just horrendously protracted. But anyway, something positive came out of Canadian politics, and we had the advent of the approval of the sports betting. I think that transpired on the 22nd of June. I think still waiting for the vote to come in. But anyway, we'd already told shareholders that we were keenly interested in being the precursor of a betting platform, but with a twist, and that is that we would also be the bank, instead of just working on the spread of bets, which is how 99.9% of other companies operate. We'd also be the bank behind that. So we are working on that right now. But anyway, that was when we revealed to everybody that was our plan. So moving on, August 10th, finally concluded the BISM inclusion inside the app. Continuing saga of top tier card issuer. Mentioned it again. Of course, we have to be forthcoming in terms of the fact that this information is ongoing. We continued at that time. Sendity, thankfully, was then launched, and then DC white labels still ongoing at that time. September the 20th, Sendity was finally launched. We've seen some nice moves in terms of that company. We still haven't seen almost anything based upon what we know will transpire. The negotiations initiated. We'd actually been talking with these entities for some time. We mentioned it in the news just so that everybody was on page. With the Ontario-based Canadian online foreign exchange, the Fortune 500 company. Again, unfortunately, even now, I cannot mention the name of these two companies. I've spoken to legal counsel about it, but we don't really want to we don't want to have any issues with the NDAs that are signed. Open banking, Canada. I've said this now for a couple of years. I guess shareholders are a little tired of listening to me talking about it. I think we're on the verge of it being introduced in Canada. I think it's going to be a lot more significant than people consider. But anyway, 20th of September is when I mentioned that once again about the importance of that particular facet of our business plan. And again, mentioning the top tier card issuer, which just seems to be a saga that's ongoing, and I'll get to that a little further along. October 19th, we finally got the MSB 2 license for the state of Florida. Lots of misconceptions surrounding this. I have spoken to shareholders about it. With this license, we are able to operate entirely in the United States. Only if we wish to pursue with advertising in local states. So let's just say, for example, Texas, that we want to put an ad in a newspaper in Texas and to ask Texans to our XYZ service. Then we need a license for the state of Texas. If we do national publications, and we do not need a license in other states. I just wanted to make clear, because there's just this huge misconception that we cannot, for example, pursue any type of economic business with somebody from Washington, Texas, California, because we don't have a license to operate in that state. That is a fallacy. Okay, so I just wanted to make that clear, because I've got so many people asking me that question, that it's really important that people understand that. We got that license just less than 2 months ago. We all know it took longer than it should have taken. These things take time. And more so when regulators are not going to the office and all these things. And I don't want to get into COVID because I'm also sick and tired of hearing about COVID. But either way, it just sometimes these things take a little more time than we anticipate. But finally, that license was approved. That particular license, its synergy with the Canadian license, the 27-country European license, and the synergy with PNC and over 120 countries that we now have bilateral agreements on a correspondent bank basis with, the passporting and all of these things. It's crucially important that shareholders understand that this was a missing piece of the puzzle. Okay, and we just got it. I mean, less than 2 months ago. Okay, I hope that everybody understands that particular aspect of why certain things will transpire based upon that advent. Okay, some of the things that seemed to be protracted are obviously, evidently, in certain cases associated with that license, which is less than 2 months old, and we are now structuring that in such a way to be able to fully exploit that whole machinery. That's the terminology I'm going to use. Machinery, everything. The 27 countries, the Canadian and the US is all an ensemble. Before I move on to the very last news release on November the 22nd, I'd like to clarify that the license from Dubai has no bearing, zero bearing on any of the other activities the company is doing. Okay, so it's got nothing to do with any of the other aspects. I've had this question over and over again. The Dubai license is intrinsically associated with Revolugroup. It is the only license that could allow that activity to take place transparently, and that is the primary focus of that particular license. So it doesn't have anything to do with the other aspects of the business, the white labels, and the other aspects that we've been dealing with. It may be a subsidiary, small asset in certain aspects, but it does not have anything to do with the other major components of the business. November 22nd, which is the very last news release that we have issued. Jason joining us, Jason Tong joining the company. There'd been discussions, talks, about CFOs for some time now. It was largely unnecessary at that particular moment in time, a couple of years back. Now it's fundamentally important. Change of Derek and Jason work together, so that's the primary motive for that particular change. Jason is going to be spearheading now the issue with the TSX. That is essentially the role that we needed to fulfill as we move ahead with that particular. Since March 2020, our revenue streams ceased, literally, overnight. Travel sales, VCC, and intrinsically associated Revolver charge deceased, basically at that time, just like every other company that was affected by COVID. Thankfully, we were able to say in that news release that we did experience and we continue to experience the recommencement of travel, recommencement of VCC, and then indirectly the recommencement of charge, because those three basically are all joined together. And again, we heard back from the DCE partners. They would like to push it forward until January. If you followed news on those partners, you'll see that certain things are going on in their world, and it starts to make a little more sense when you actually look behind the curtain in terms of what they're currently doing. Um, Negotiations still ongoing with the Canadian online foreign exchange. Fortune still ongoing right now as we speak. Top tier card issue and negotiations have advanced to a point in which have made a formal request to tell shareholders who this entity is. The rigidity of that particular NDA does not allow me to make any statements. So I've made a formal request, basically because we're moving now past what I consider to be first base. Petitions, filling out, providing certain references from central banks and things like that. That for me is the next step, and I want the shareholders to know. So expect to hear from me soon. I place pressure on that particular entity to allow us to be able to tell you who this entity is and the significance of that entity for our future in many aspects. DFSA, probably a similar scenario, again, being wholly protracted. We have had good news coming out of there, but the problem that I see with that personally is the same old. And I promised a few moments ago not to get into the COVID thing, but it's quite surprising to me that the regulators have been probably the most difficult to deal with during this whole issue that's been ongoing for so long now. It just seems to be going on forever. And final point in that particular news, and I hope I haven't dragged on too much, was to try and allow shareholders to understand the importance of these white labels. When we first started speaking earlier this year, back in June, about how we intended to move forward with these white labels, it was just I guess for shareholders was okay. Well, seems like a good plan. But in November, we're talking about the fact that not only has our technology been embraced, but it's in use. It's being utilized daily by significant figures in certain spheres, and obviously working in these different areas. Really important, and this is going to bring me on now to the overall synopsis of the year, and just to give everybody a heads up as to what it is that you can expect of the company. It's conceptually speaking, those two white labels were a taster of what it is that our technology can do. We can expect more white labels like that within, let's call it, the Revolugroup sphere. We can also expect that the NGOs themselves who are seeing this take place, and in certain parts of the world, it is actually the NGO directly. So there's no third party in the middle that is providing this aid. And they have difficulties, and sometimes it's really expensive. And anybody who's followed what's happened in Lebanon, the banks were originally the sole entities involved in providing the aid, and the amount of money that's vanished is just unbelievable. That's just ongoing all over the place. It's a good example to use Lebanon, but it's ongoing all over the place. So these NGOs are really interested in having a company that, as I said, Revolugroup humanitarian, that we were not in this to rip and pillage, as some of them are. But I'll move away from Send for a second, because we've shown that we can do that. And let's move on to Revolux. I've always been reticent in terms of allowing the two-way street with i.e. the acquisition of crypto, for obvious reasons, because we were going through a transitional period. Central banks and regulators were not clear as to whether that was an asset class or not. And I didn't want to put shareholders at risk. It's as simple as that. Obviously, there's a great opportunity out there, and some companies have grasped that opportunity, and some of them have traded very, very well indeed by what I consider taking those risks. And there are always going to be two camps here. There's always going to be the camp that says, hey, well, you should have jumped in and done that in the beginning. I saw that as too much of a risk. But needless to say, we spoke with the central bank 2 months ago because we received communication from the central bank in Europe asking us which entities we were processing payments for in the crypto sphere. Now, that is more significant than most people think because we weren't doing that. But that is a tacit recognition by the central bank asking licensed entities, tell us who you're working with. So I see that as a green light. I see that as a means by which we, obviously it's becoming recognized as an asset class. So my reticence and fear in terms of protecting shareholders is somewhat diminished. And I do intend to pursue early next year that two-way street. As you know, I've always proposed a one-way street, which is from crypto to fiat, which is basically an exit from the crypto sphere, which was always recognized by the central banks and the regulators as obviously they want funds to go back into fiat. They're going to try and hinder that process. But there is evidently a lot more economic benefit in the other direction. And that is why we've had cries from shareholders to get involved in that. Some companies have jumped in, some jumped in too soon, had problems through it, some lost their licenses. I did not want to subject shareholders to that period of time, which was over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years. And I think that the decision was a good one. Now we're seeing recognition of the asset class. The risk is minimized, and for that reason, we will move ahead with the two-way street. Moving on to just the remaining part of the synopsis for the year. Everything that we have done, Revolugroup VIP is a white label at the end of the day. Okay, we brought out this technology to show that it works. We have recognition by consumers, publicly speaking, that it works. But evidently, the push for that is into a white label scenario with the likes of companies such as the one I mentioned a few moments ago at the beginning of the first news releases of this year, the mobile phone company in the Caribbean, the other mobile phone company that I've spoken about that is extremely active in South America. That is where you'll see Revolugroup VIP be pushed forth into an ensemble of different verticals in a particular package. And the same goes for Revolugroup X, white label. We've already mentioned who the initial partners for that are going to be. But there are obviously more, and especially if we adopt the two-way street that I've mentioned. More so, because the big dilemma that these DCEs have is precisely the one that we've always been able to resolve, which is the onboarding, which is basically using our bank license to allow people to purchase crypto that, as I've said, we have shied away from to protect our shareholders. But since recognition is now from the central bank and also the regulators in the United States, I personally dealt with the United States, and the regulator open. I was quite shocked, completely open to us onboarding from fiat to. So there's been a seismic change, and that people can look at this in whichever way they wish. Whether we should have jumped in 18 months ago when we first got the PSD2, could we have capitalized? Possibly, yes. We could have flowed the funds that some of the funds that some of these entities that you've seen that are using third-party licenses. We'd have had our proprietary license. But you've also seen some of these companies get shut down. You've also seen some of these companies lose their licenses. You've also seen them being used as scapegoats, witch hunt, and the rest of it. And I obviously didn't want that as the CEO for our shareholders. The risk aspect, to me personally, was too great. So I don't want to belabor that point too much, but I think it's fundamental that everybody understands why I had that reticence and why I thought it really important to ensure the integrity of the company until the asset class was starting to be recognized by these central banks and regulators. That time has arrived, believe it or not, it's arrived. So anyway, I don't want to belabor that any longer. What I am going to do is I'm going to clearly stipulate here that we have had a period of time, I've gone through the news releases so that shareholders can understand that the year has been tinged with two aspects. One is positive outcomes. The other is just continuing protracted issues. I don't need to tell you guys what those protracted issues are. I'm sure you're fully fluent on the fact that you're waiting for the card issuer, you're waiting for the white label on the DCs, and other aspects, things that basically we started talking about at the start of the year, and why are these things taking so long? So, in a nutshell, we're at the combination stage of this business plan. These are the biggest parts of the business plan. They're the ones that make the most noise. They're the ones that generate the most volumes. And they're sort of not the end game for the company, but the end game for the business plan that was proposed back in 2016. This is it. This is these white labels just flourishing, new ones coming on board, and all of these aspects. But the fundamental part of this to understand is that the absolute size of these businesses sometimes makes them more protracted than the simple aspects that we had throughout the years. We could consider them smaller aspects. Even the PSD2, although significant, was a smaller aspect compared to, for example, the DCEs, because these are huge businesses in themselves. The same thing with the card, with the primary card issuer subject. Fundamental to certain aspects of ongoing parts of the white label structuring. So those various verticals that are pending, Revolugroup transfer seems to be a long ongoing saga. I mean, it's related to Revolugroup Realty. It's related to movement of large amounts of capital. We have the entities lined up to work with that particular structure, but the entities required to be able to put that together are the ones that are still pending, of which we literally expected to have news out this month about the conclusion of that. But for one reason or another, it's just taking longer than we originally thought. So that is basically the synopsis of where we expect to go over the next 6 to 12 months. Just continued rollout of the white labels into other areas. right now we only have Send that's operational, 2 entities utilizing that. But obviously the others need to be out there. VIP needs to be out there. EX needs to be out there. And the others, which are just basically additions to those others. And then transfer obviously is a key element, because this is the large amounts of money are the easy part to move around, especially in the real estate industry. They're a lot easier than these smaller, 50,000 remittances, $100. That on an operational basis is obviously far more complicated than $5 million to buy a property in Toronto, right? But the upside financially, and obviously the savings that we can instill in that sort of transaction, are what we're pursuing. So Revolute transfer is obviously key. Anyway, Jim, I don't know if you managed to stay through all of this, but I'm just, apparently I should be able to see questions from shareholders here. Oh, here we go. What if I hit chat? Jim, do I?
If there's any questions, I'd set up the chat site. You can ask.
Okay, I can see it, right. So let me just look here, because I'm starting to see here.
There's not much there.
If anybody has any questions,